Boom, 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 boom. Hey, everyone. Conor Cunneen, Irishman Speaks here, and welcome to Suppose You Were an Idiot, Mark Twain on Politics and Politicians. The words and commentary from Mark Twain in this program were written well over 100 years ago. They could have been written yesterday, because as what we will see in this program is that there is very little new under the sun when it comes to politics. And Mark Twain was a wonderful commentator who saw through a lot of the cant and hypocrisy of politicians. The title of the presentation, Suppose You Were an Idiot, Mark Twain on Politics and Politicians, comes from a quote that Mark Twain wrote when he said, "Suppose you were an idiot. Suppose you were a congressman." But I repeat myself. And maybe I should clarify. I said the words and commentary could have been written yesterday by Mark Twain. I think they could have been written this morning, today, and I'm sure they'll apply to tomorrow as well. Now, we know Mark Twain as a humorist and as an author. He was also an astonishingly successful professional speaker who entranced audiences from India to Iowa, from New Zealand to New York. When we hear of the words of Mark Twain, we think of a funny man, a humorist, an author, a light-hearted figure that you'd love to have as a friendly neighbor or as your grandpa. However, Twain was also, particularly in his later years, a very angry, acerbic social commentator who despised the cant and the hypocrisy of politicians. And he got to such a stage that he would have been the kind of cranky neighbor that you did not want to meet when you were walking down the street. But most of his commentary was very much on point. Much of Twain's commentary came from his rather jaundiced view of mankind. He said, "Man is the only animal that blushes, or needs to." Concerning the difference between man and the jackass, some observers hold that there isn't any, but this wrongs the jackass, he wrote in his notebook in 1898. And finally, he made the comment that man was made at the end of the week's work, when God was tired. And I think he particularly felt that politicians and those who enter the political environment and enter the legislature were the weakest and worst of God's creation. In this program, we will discover which president Twain referred to as a very great man and superlatively good. We'll also look at which president he considered to be the most formidable disaster to hit the country. And it isn't just US politics we're going to be concerned about here. Twain referred to one European monarch as a bloody monster whose personality will surely shame hell itself. Who was that? Okay, it's time for a few quips. Yeah, from my book, Suppose You Were an Idiot, Mark Twain on Politics and Politicians. A few short ones. Okay, folks, here we go with a few little quips from Mark Twain. This vile, dirty effort to rob the public treasury by the kites and vultures that now infest the filthy den called Congress. He didn't really like congressmen, did he? Not at all, not at all. All Congresses and Parliament have a kindly feeling for idiots and a compassion for them on account of personal experience and heredity. Oh, Mark. Before we go into the political commentary of Twain, let's have a brief look at his biography and life. Mark Twain was born in Florida, Missouri in 1835. He spent almost 75 years on this planet. He came in, as he said, with Halley's Comet, and he left with Halley's Comet. He had a particularly happy childhood, especially after the family moved from Florida, Missouri to Hannibal, Missouri, where he spent about 10 to 12 years before he left to do some odd jobs, including becoming a printer's apprentice. Twain actually visited his hometown in 1902. And as you can see here, the house still exists, and you can see your presenter and curator of this program outside the front of the house on a freezing winter's day. Now, Twain was an adventurous person all of his life. Research suggests that he traveled to about 32 countries in total, but he was always searching for something new and interesting. One of his dreams as a young kid, was to become a riverboat pilot. And he actually did achieve that dream just a few years before the Civil War. And this was a dream that was something that he looked back on for the rest of his life. Oh, that was the darling existence. There has been nothing comparable to it in my life since. He wrote a wonderful book called Life in the Mississippi, which outlines some of his experiences on the riverboat and being a pilot. And it's a truly interesting, fun, and very educational read. But the Civil War interrupted Twain's idyllic life. He became a Confederate soldier for all of 2 weeks, joining a militia, and after 2 weeks deciding this wasn't for him, and as he says in one of his writings, he lit out for the territory. And he went over to the Nevada territories and the West Coast, where he spent the rest of the Civil War. Twain's fame as a writer started initially because of a short story he wrote titled The Jumping Frog of Calaveras County, which actually was not his own original writing. It was a story he heard around a campfire one day, but he put it in paper and he got quite a good name for himself as a result of that. He then went to the Sandwich Islands, which we now know as Hawaii, and wrote some very humorous, interesting articles on Hawaii. One of the articles, he said that on one occasion he came across a number of Hawaiian ladies who were bathing naked in the sea. And being a gentleman, he said, I sat on their clothes until they came out in case someone stole them. Hey, he was a gentleman. In 1870, Mark Twain married Olivia Langdon Clemens, and they had a very happy marriage for over 30 years. But Twain did not have a particularly happy life in many ways. His firstborn child, Langdon Clemens, died when the kid was less than 2 years of age. His adored daughter, Susie, died at the age of 24. His darling wife, Olivia Clemens, died a few years later, and then in 2009, he lost another daughter, Jean. He was only survived by one daughter. These losses, which Twain had difficulty coming to grips with, as one could imagine, were often, I think, the genesis for Twain's sadness, depression, and anger as he got older. He was also famous as a speaker, and you could make a strong argument that Twain was the most successful professional speaker ever in terms of the number of miles that he traveled and the number of engagements he had over a 30-plus year speaking career. When he ran into serious financial difficulties in 1894, 1895, he decided to go on a world tour. He traveled from Vancouver to Australia and New Zealand, where he spoke to packed houses at the end of 1895, early 1896. When he left there, he then went to India, again spoke to packed houses, and then he came to South Africa, where again there was rousing reception for the man. Twain got universal recognition, including an honorary doctorate from Oxford University, and he left this world in 1910, a beloved figure, although many people never really appreciated just how radical and progressive his thinking was. In The Gilded Age, he wrote of one of the characters, Alice was one of those patriotic women in the rural districts who think that men are still selected for Congress on account of qualifications for the office. Twain. In The Innocents Abroad, he wrote of Congress in general, they carry themselves high and as prudent men, and though they are fools, yet they would seem to be teachers. Now, you may be wondering, how come an Irishman is doing a program on Mark Twain? I have to tell you that when I was growing up, we never learned anything about Mark Twain back in Ireland, because let me tell you, the only literature that the Christian Brothers allowed us to read was about good Irish Catholic patriots who were killed by the despised English. Anything that wasn't written by an Irish person was basically not any good. And if the Irish person was Protestant, it probably wasn't even any good either. So our writings and our readings were pretty limited. Twain did visit Ireland on at least one occasion. He actually crossed the pond across the Atlantic over 20 times in his career. He did have Irish connections in that his coachman of over 30 years, a man by the name of Patrick McAleer, was, in Twain's opinion, the very definition of a gentleman. And Twain writes glowingly about Patrick McAleer in a number of instances. Twain's housekeeper was Katie Leary, born to Irish immigrants, and she spent all of Twain's later years working with Twain and living with Twain. And when Twain's daughter Jean died in 2009, it was Katie Leary that found Jean. Katie Leary did write a book about her experiences with Twain a few years after Twain's death. Also, I should tell you that while a lot of people say that Twain spoke very, very slowly and with an accent, there is not one recorded incident that I have found that said Mark Twain did not have an Irish brogue. Boom, boom. Okay, I kind of think Twain would like that little comment. After his trip to Ireland, Twain wrote an interesting and sometimes humorous piece about the sectarianism that divided Northern Ireland in particular. He wrote that each party does all it can to make its own doctrines popular and draw the affections of the irreligious towards them. One hears constantly of the most touching instances of this zeal, the great humorist wrote. And he went on to say, a week ago, a vast concourse of Catholics assembled at Armagh to dedicate a new cathedral. And when they started home again, the roadways were lined with groups of meek and lowly Protestants who stoned them till all the regions round about was marked with blood. I thought that only Catholics argued in that way, but it seems to be a mistake. Twain also recounted a joke he heard when he was in Belfast. At that time, the government was trying to make some effort to reduce the sectarian tension, and it introduced a law that if someone used sectarian language, they could be fined up to 40 shillings, which was a lot of money in those days. And basically, if you were found shouting out something like, to hell with Pope or to hell with Protestants, you could get fined. The joke went as Twain recounted. A policeman saw a drunk on one occasion shouting out something like, to hell with, to hell with. The policeman, as Twain says, smelling a fine, goes up to the drunk and he says, what are you saying? And the drunk says, to hell with, to hell with. Finish the sentence. What are you saying? You're saying to hell with who? To hell with what? And the drunk decides, it'll be too expensive for me to finish it. Boom, boom. Okay, that was a kind of humor that was going around when Twain visited Belfast. It could probably be shown by facts and figures that there is no distinctly Native American criminal class except Congress. And then, of course, he said, suppose you were an idiot. Suppose you were a congressman. But I repeat myself. What? I know I said it already, but I'd like to repeat it. I mean, you can't disagree with it. Okay, on to the next element of suppose you were an idiot. Mark Twain on politics and politicians. Mark Twain referenced many presidents over his years. Of George Washington, he wrote, yes, I think he was the most remarkable man the country has ever produced. Up to my time, anyway. Twain often referenced the Washington anecdote, Father, I cannot tell a lie, I cut the tree, in his writings and speeches. In a 1901 speech, He said, "The greatness of this country rests on two anecdotes. The first one is that of Washington and his hatchet, representing the foundation of true speaking, which is the characteristic of our people." Mind you, it should also be said that he was not always as laudatory as that when speaking about the characteristic of our people. In a speech in 1873, he wrote, "I think I can say, and say with pride, that we have legislators that bring higher prices than any in the world." And he also wrote, "It's hard to find men of so high type of morals that they'll stay bought." But Twain was, I think, entranced with the George Washington story about cutting the tree and being honest. And to an extent, George Washington seemed to be almost a conscience or a guardian angel for Twain. To some extent, I think Twain was kind of entranced about the George Washington telling the truth story in the cherry tree. In a story he often told about his youth, Twain's youth, he said that when he was a young lad, Twain stole a watermelon. He took it away from the farmer's place, broke it open, and found it to be green, impossibly, hopelessly green. He started to have second thoughts about stealing the watermelon, and in his mind, he thought, "Ooh, what would George Washington do?" So he decided, "All right, I'll return the watermelon to the farmer from whom I stole it." Twain returns the watermelon to the farmer, but then he writes and says, "But I had a duty to that farmer as well as to myself. I told him he ought to be ashamed of himself giving his customers green watermelons." The farmer, Twain claims, gave him a new watermelon in exchange. Maybe he didn't take Washington's truth telling to the extreme it should be taken to there. He also spoke about his butler, a former slave, a man by the name of George Griffin, who spent almost 20 years with Twain. He said George was a great person, but he had only one fault: young George Washington's. He couldn't tell a lie. But Twain says he trained the butler to such an extent that it breaks Mrs. Clemens's heart to hear the butler stand at the front door and lie to the unwelcome visitor that Mr. Twain is not at home. Mark Twain fought for the Confederacy for a very short period, but was a great fan of Abraham Lincoln. Twain himself was born into a family of slave owners and a religious culture that never decried slavery. But over time, he appreciated the horrors of the slave trade. And I think The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn would be seen as being as one of the great anti-racism books ever written. He spoke of Abraham Lincoln, who he said was the great American who not only set the blacks free, but set the white man free also. Twain also said that our Civil War was a blot on our history, but not as great a blot as the buying and selling of Negro souls. Over the years, Twain made a number of very positive comments and speeches about Abraham Lincoln. In 1901, when Twain was speaking at a Lincoln birthday celebration attended by both Union and Confederate veterans, he said, "We are here to honor the birthday of the greatest citizen and the noblest and the best after Washington that this land or any other land has yet produced. We come here and bare our heads in reverence and love of that noble soul whom 40 years ago we tried with all our hearts and all our strength to defeat and dispossess. Abraham Lincoln." But who was the most interesting personality that Twain ever encountered? It happened to be another person who was on the opposite side of Twain during his period in the Civil War, and that was Ulysses S. Grant. Surprisingly, for a person who was known as unconditional surrender Grant, Twain said, "I have not known a man with a kinder nature or purer character." Twain first met Grant in the late 1860s. They didn't have a lot of contact and communication at that time. Grant, though, was responsible for two major stories in relation to Twain. Story number one was that after Grant went on a world tour and returned to the United States in 1879, he'd finished his presidency at this stage, the two-term presidency. He came back and Chicago provided a major party, welcome home party for Grant. It effectively took 3 days. Part of the partying involved a gala dinner for Grant at the Palmer House Hotel in Chicago, where 500 people, including Sherman, Sheridan, and other generals of the Union Army, attended. But let's pause for a moment before we go to that speech, because during Grant's world tour, where he was received with high praise and enthusiastic crowds in most places, he visited Ireland. And like most of the countries he visited, he got quite an enthusiastic response in Dublin and the north of Ireland. However, the planned visit to Cork never happened because the great citizens of Cork and the councilmen of Cork decided that Grant was anti-Catholic. Now, it's debatable whether or not Grant was really anti-Catholic, but he did sponsor some legislation that promoted the separation of state and religious education. So the people of Cork decided this man was anti-Catholic. He was not accorded a civic reception in Cork. So there's my county of Cork, ever the rebels. But let's go back to Twain's speech in Chicago celebrating Grant. This dinner was held at the Palmer House, attended by about 500 people, including veterans of the Civil War. Twain got up to speak at 2 a.m. Did he say 2 a.m.? He did. 2 a.m. That's like 2 o'clock in the morning to do a speech. Yep. As comics today might say, Twain killed. He wrote his beloved wife after that, apparently at 5 o'clock in the morning, that General Grant sat through 14 speeches like a graven image. But I fetched him. I broke him up utterly. He told me he laughed till the tears came and every bone in his body ached. Twain and Grant became good friends. In 1884, while writing his memoirs, Grant was diagnosed with throat cancer. Although contracted to another publisher, Grant agreed to let Twain publish his memoirs. Twain was of the view that Grant, who was almost penniless at this stage, at that time the US president and politicians did not get any major pension. Twain, concerned about how penniless the family would be after Grant died, promised Grant royalties that were far in excess of anything that was ever seen previously. Indeed, after the book was published, Twain's royalties to Grant exceeded over $400,000, actually almost $500,000, the highest amount of royalties ever paid for a book that is really well worth reading, Grant's memoirs. Big book, but well worth reading. Twain wrote of the man known as Unconditional Surrender Grant. He was called the Silent Man, and he was that in public, but not in private. There he was a fluent and able talker with a large sense of humor. In completing his memoirs, Grant wrote up to 10,000 words a day, and as Twain reported, one day he put his pencil aside and said there was nothing more to do. Grant was dead within the... In the New York Tribune, March 1873, he wrote, "I never can think of Judas Iscariot without losing my temper. To my mind, Judas Iscariot was nothing but a low, mean, premature congressman." Ouch. end of burglars who broke into his home, he wrote. Now they are in jail, and if they keep on, they will go to Congress. When a person starts downhill, you can never tell where he's going to stop. But let's go back to more serious commentary for a moment. As you may appreciate at this stage, Mark Twain could be a brutal commentator, but some of the people he commented on were nothing short of brutal. And the man he had a particular disdain for and who he thoroughly despised was King Leopold of the Belgians, whose brutal reign in the Congo was responsible for the death of between 5 and 10 million native Congolese. Leopold was given the rights, private rights to the Congo in 1885. It was a country that was rich in natural resources, especially rubber, which was harvested aggressively. Congolese workers who did not produce the absurd quotas that were forced upon them were tortured, raped, brutalized, and killed. But as Twain said, for some of them it was even worse than that, because if you did not reach your quota, the poor Congolese worker had a hand or hands cut off. It was this type of activity that Twain had in mind probably when he said, man is the only animal that deals in that atrocity of atrocities, war. He is the only one that gathers his brethren about him and goes forth in cold blood to exterminate his kind. He is the only animal that for sordid wages will march out and help to slaughter strangers of his own species who have done him no harm and with whom he has no quarrel. Interestingly, one of the people who brought the Congolese situation to the public forefront was Roger Casement, an Irish-born diplomat who was working in the Congo for the British Foreign Service. He was knighted for his services to the British Empire, Sir Roger Casement, but in 1912 he joined the Irish Volunteers, and in 1916 was actually executed for his work supporting the 1916 Rising. Roger Casement was interred at Pentonville Prison in England, and 49 years later his body was repatriated to Ireland, where he received a state funeral. But it was reports from people like Casement and others that highlighted just how bad things were in the Congo. Twain said of Leopold that he sits at home and drinks blood. I have seen photographs of the natives with their hands cut off because they did not bring in the requited amount of rubber. He summed up Leopold saying, in 14 years, Leopold has deliberately destroyed more lives than have suffered death on all of the battlefields of this planet for the past 1,000 years. And Twain said, Nero, Caligula, Attila the Hun, and Genghis Khan, and such killers of men are mere amateurs besides Leopold, the pirate king of the Belgians. All congresses and parliaments, he wrote in his autobiography, have a kindly feeling for idiots and a compassion for them on account of personal experience and heredity. And he also wrote about England, a country he really enjoyed visiting. He said, here in England, they have the oddest ways. They won't tell a spoken lie. Nothing can persuade them, except in large moral interests like politics or religion.